ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the Zombie Train. This is episode number 298, and I'm your host, Ellis, otherwise known as Train Man. This week we have a question from Spring Marionette, posted in the comments of episode 231. Remember, if you have a question about anything Zombie Train, post it down here. If not, post it in the comments of Under Construction. Anyway, Spring Marionette says, "Thank you for choosing my comment. Also, how many airships did you have and how long did it take to fix or make one?" Us personally, in Zombie Train Incorporated, we only had one. It was a dirigible that we named the Enterprise. It was designed after the Akron and Macon, which were airships in the 1930s, I believe, or the 1920s. They were designed as literally floating aircraft carriers. They were designed to be extremely long-range reconnaissance aircraft, which could then carry a number of parasite biplanes. So they had a hangar on board with 3 or 5, depending on the ship, biplanes that would be able to launch from the airship and then return to the airship and dock with it, or get caught on a trapeze, as it's known, and then hauled back up into the ship. So, if you're interested in more of the, more about the airship itself, I recommend you look up those two and read about their service careers and their construction and stuff like that. Now, I personally don't know how long it took to build the Enterprise. What I do know is that it did take a big chunk of the resources of the Navy at the time, and when it was completed, it was deemed too big, basically. It was external to their needs, and they realized that flying heavier than aircraft as complements to it were sort of defeated the premise, because the thing with the airship is it's very, very quiet, relatively speaking. The engines are, even if they're in the external nacelles, which even if they're in external nacelles, airships are generally much quieter than heavier than aircraft, because the engines have to work not nearly as hard, and also you can turn them off and coast and not worry about falling out of the sky. And if the engines are interior, then you can have, padding and insulation around them to keep them from being noisy. So that was one of the things that the Enterprise and that the blimps that they had available excelled at. Now, they did have blimps from before the war. They were the Goodyear blimps, and the utility of those for supply and for reconnaissance can't be overstated, I suppose. And that is what inspired them to build the D-Corps. The D-Corps is the dirigible corps. It was part of the U.S. Navy. It was built wholly during World War Z. And it started right alongside the Enterprise's construction. So, maybe a couple of years in, when they had a half-decent foothold on the West Coast and we were still back east, they started work on 2 projects. One was the Enterprise, which was the Z, or the Big Z, because it was being called a Zeppelin at that time, even though Zeppelin and dirigible are pretty much interchangeable. Zeppelin is more like a brand name. And also they didn't want to call it the Big D for obvious reasons. And then the D Corps, and they were 2 competing projects. The dirigible corps made a number of smaller airships which proved to be more useful, and the Z project, or Project Z, turned into ZTZ-1, the Enterprise. And again, that was given to us as a gift, or really as a bribe, in order to start the Zombie Train Incorporated. And also because I wanted to use it as a way to look for Weibold when he was out, when he was lost, really, when he had his assault on Annex, as he called it. And yeah, and after that basically dropped off the face of the earth, nobody knew where he was, nobody really cared. So we went out to find him because, well, I wanted to know where he was, and for that we used the Enterprise. And yeah, that was kind of a big deal. Also, the thing that I was going to come around to is, because of the fact that the Enterprise it was very large. That's very obvious, but it did have internal engines, and so at night you could conduct very low to the ground passes of areas in order to survey them. Even in daytime you could get away with it, because if the zombies don't notice you, and yes, zombies are particularly vigilant, and they have extremely good hearing, but you can have a minor distraction and then have the Enterprise, or one of the blimps of the D-Corps, again, they weren't blimps, but, they improperly referred to them as blimps all the time, and that got on my nerves. Anyway, one of the ships of the D-Corps could do these low-pass aerial surveys. The D-Corps was worse off for it because they actually had externally mounted engine units, and the Enterprise, being large enough, had internally mounted engines, which were then, geared to the propellers, or, there was a drivetrain there. I wanna pull up real quick what the D-Corps ships were based off of. I just can't remember. What are these? I don't know. They were based off of another U.S. Navy design, and they were sort of a mash between, I think they were based off of the K class, maybe, or maybe one of the earlier classes of blimps, and they blended those with the plans that Goodyear Zeppelin had for the next generation of Goodyear airships, which never came to fruition, as you might expect. But they did, sort of happen in the sense that the Navy then adapted that design for use with the D-Corps. So, I can't tell you how long it took to make one of these. I know that with the D-Corps ships, they could put one together in a few months, at least when I got to know them, or, a little bit later. As I understand, the Enterprise took a year or so, at least, to get put together. I just know that when we had visited originally, the Big Z and the D-Corps projects were both underway, and that was right before the Battle of Portland. And then sometime later, and I don't have my timeline on me right now, but sometime later when I went back, that's when the D-Corps was basically in full swing, and the Enterprise, or what would become the Enterprise, it didn't actually have a name, had just been completed. So, yeah, like I said, the thing that sort of put the nail in the coffin for the Enterprise was the fact that it took a lot longer to build, and it didn't really have many advantages over the smaller D-Corps ships. It had a marginally longer range, it had a much larger payload, but all things considered, that didn't really matter that much, and it was quieter, but when you're up in the sky, you get a pretty good vantage point anyway. Doing the low-pass observations was not something that happened very often. And the other thing is the added complexity of having the hangar bay and, like I said, the relative uselessness of the planes, which I would disagree that they're useless because we use them a hell of a lot, but we were using them for a variety of purposes kind of outside the scope of what the Navy was intending to do, which was very simple, like reconnaissance and supply missions. Just an aside with those planes, some of them were equipped with landing gear, some of them were not. Some of them had extra fuel tanks fitted instead of landing gear, because they had a big hook on the top, which you would use to grab the trapeze and to get onto the Zeppelin. There was only one time a problem with that, and what ended up happening was an aircraft, one of the Sparrowhawk 2s, which is what we called the planes. Again, they were based out, or not again, but for reference, they were based off of the Sparrowhawk design, which was what was used with the Acron and the Macon way back when. One of the planes did not have enough fuel to make it back. I think it was a mechanical problem with the fuel supply, whatever that may be, whether it was a leak or whether it was a clogged tube or something. But the plane was not getting fuel from the external tank that they had fitted, and they had to do a water landing with that plane. It was eventually recovered, though. In fact, I think it's still in serviceable condition. Right now, the Enterprise is basically a big PR device. We don't take it out very much because, because A, helium is expensive, B, fuel is expensive, and that's the other thing that was an issue with the Enterprise. Because it was so much larger, it consumed a hell of a lot more fuel than any of the D-Corps ships. And also, I mean, there really just isn't a use to it. Let's be honest, there's a reason that airships went out of style, and it's not just because the Hindenburg went down a ball of flames. I'm a huge fan of airships, obviously, or I wouldn't have been so giddy about getting the Enterprise in the first place, because it makes you a giant floating target sometimes. But yeah, even I can face the music that it's a huge, cumbersome gas bag, and is really only useful in a situation where you're operating well beyond any sort of supply line. These days, there really aren't that many areas left. If the D-Corps gets called out to action, it's usually way up in the Northwestern Territory or Alaska or whatever. Way up there in Canada or out in very remote areas in the desert, or in the mountains or whatever. There are still plenty of wasteland areas. In fact, there are still areas that are basically treated as totally packed full of zombies, even if they aren't. A lot of downtown city centers are still fairly dangerous, and some of the D-Corps does stay on standby to patrol these areas from the sky. That is not something we use the Enterprise for, though. The Enterprise is... Well, we don't want to lose her, first of all. Second of all those issues that I just mentioned with operating the Enterprise, why it's such a logistical pain in the butt. And furthermore, we don't really want to take it very far a lot of times, because there are very few facilities that can actually handle her. There are only a few of those giant hangars left, and we had to build a temporary structure. Well, still there. Temporary structure at Quonset, in order to dock the Enterprise. Yeah, there aren't that many. There's one out in Akron, and there's one in San Francisco, and there's one out in Colorado, and I'm not sure where another one is. I know there are a couple more still around. There are these huge, huge, huge hangars. They're impossible to miss. But a lot of them, because they're just massive hangars, and because there weren't that many airship bases, they're all relics. None of them are new build. The place to actually store the ship for a long period of time is... Or places to actually store the ship for any length of time are very few and far between. Right now, the Enterprise is not here in Quonset. Right now, the Enterprise is in San Francisco, in the hangar there. I think awaiting some minor repairs, probably engine work. That's the other thing. The engines that went into it are not ideal. I don't know the specifics on it, but they had to cut down on weight, and they had to cut down on fuel consumption, and that sort of thing, and it ended up resulting in very finicky engines. The amount of times that we had to limp the Enterprise somewhere on, 4 props, because, one of the engines failed, or 2 of the engines failed, is non-zero and kind of high. So, yeah. Anyway, I was about to launch into the outro, but we're almost at the or I have a little bit of extra time. I've been cutting myself off. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you next week. The Enterprise is one of my favorite little pieces of Zombie Train lore. Trainman out.